African-American girl helps a Hell's Angel with cash. 1,000 bikers show up at her home the next day. When a quiet African-American girl pressed a crumpled 5 into a stranger's palm, she didn't know he wore a patch feared in every city. She didn't know that 5 would travel through a sea of leather and roaring engines, and that by morning 1,000 bikes would rumble to her mother's porch, demanding to repay a debt the world couldn't understand. Before we dive deeper into this story, let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Long before 1,000 engines rumbled down her street, before the news vans and whispered rumors, there was just Keisha, 10 years old, soft-spoken, the kind of kid who said, "Yes, ma'am, and no, sir," to neighbors who barely noticed her name. An African-American child tucked into a weathered apartment on the edge of a bustling block where dreams shriveled under unpaid rent and buzzing streetlights. Her mother, Miss Lena, said Keisha was born with an old soul, the kind that feels storms before they break, and mercy before the world knows it's needed. Every afternoon after school, Keisha slipped off her worn sneakers by the door and stepped into chores most kids her age would never touch. Mopping floors, delivering mail for the elderly lady 2 floors up, weeding planters she didn't plant. And every dollar she earned, every wrinkled bill she dropped into a plastic bottle on her dresser. A water bottle with fading stickers scrolled in purple marker goals. It wasn't much, mostly singles and 5s. A few stray 10s when she cleaned the community center or carried groceries for the friendly man with a soft spot for neighborhood kids. Miss Lena told her it was for college or maybe medical school, if the Lord saw fit. A quiet promise tucked between bedtime stories and the hum of the old air conditioner. On a Thursday that smelled like exhaust fumes and hot asphalt, Keisha lugged the bottle in her backpack, planning to trade the bills for a few sketchbooks and a new pair of jeans. But halfway down Maple Avenue, she saw him leaning beside a rusted gas pump that hadn't seen fresh paint since her mom was a girl. He was huge, bigger than her cousins, wrapped in sun-bleached leather, wild beard curling like smoke under his chin. His boots were scuffed, his knuckles raw. One saddlebag lay open near his back wheel. The bike leaned awkward on its stand like it might collapse under him. And in his giant hands, just a scatter of bills, singles, and quarters that didn't add up to enough. Keisha stopped a few steps away. She felt her mom's voice inside her. "Don't stare." But she stared anyway, not at the tattoos curling down his forearms or the faded patch on his vest, but at his eyes. Tired eyes. Eyes that have been waiting too long for someone to see past the patch. She could have walked on. Nobody would blame a small African-American girl for keeping her head down around a man who looked like trouble carved in leather. But Keisha never learned to flinch at the rough edges of people. She stepped closer, bottle pressed to her chest like a secret. When the man looked up, she could see he'd been counting the bills over and over, like maybe the math would change if he stared hard enough. He started to say something. "Maybe don't bother, or I'm fine." But she cut him off with that tiny clatter of plastic and paper. She unscrewed the cap with trembling fingers, poured out every bill she had, and dropped them for $5.83 in loose cash right into his enormous grease-cracked palm. For a second, he just held it there. The bills looked small in that palm, like a child's offering to a giant. He opened his mouth, shut it again, tried to speak, but found no words worth spilling on a girl like her. So, he asked the only thing he could manage. Why? Keisha shrugged like it was nothing at all, because to her, maybe it was. "You look tired," she said softly, barely above the traffic noise. "My mom says when you can help, you help. That's it." She didn't wait for thanks. Didn't ask for his name. She slipped her empty bottle back into her bag and turned toward the cracked sidewalk, walking away like she just handed over spare candy or an extra marker, not her whole goals bottle in one breath. Behind her, the man Reaper, though she didn't know his name yet, stood frozen under the blinking neon of the gas station sign. The bills rustled gently against each other in his hand, like a reminder of something he'd almost forgotten how to believe in. And when her small frame disappeared around the corner, Reaper didn't climb on his bike. He didn't count the bills again. Instead, he pulled a battered flip phone from his vest pocket. The same pocket that once had a knife, a faded photo, a patch sewn over with sins and loyalty. He scrolled through names he hadn't dialed in years. Men who rode through fire and fences for a brother who asked only once. He pressed one number and brought the phone to his ear. His voice cracked open the quiet. Somewhere far off, an engine roared to life. The next morning came soft and gray, a sky swollen with the promise of rain that never quite fell. In the small apartment on the edge, Keisha wiped crumbs from the cracked kitchen counter while Miss Lena hummed an old tune that floated through the open window and onto the balcony. Keisha hadn't thought much about the cash. Not after she walked away. Not after her mom asked why her goals bottle sat empty by the bed. She just said, "He looked tired. Mom, I'll fill it up again." And Miss Lena kissed her forehead the way moms do when they're proud, but too worried to say so out loud. Around noon, when the neighborhood settled into its usual hustle, dogs barking behind chain link, kids at school, buses sighing down busy streets, the low rumble of an old SUV broke the calm like a growl at the door. It wasn't the roar of a Harley or the thunder of a gang rolling through town. Just an old Chevy paint flaking at the wheel wells, one headlight half clouded like a tired eye. Keisha watched from the window as the stranger climbed down. He looked smaller without his bike, though he still moved like a man who'd fought off winters and men twice his size. His boots crunched gravel as he hoisted 2 heavy grocery bags from the trunk, the kind of bags that sag under fresh fruit, canned goods, bread that hadn't sat stale on a shelf for a week. Miss Lena met him at the building steps, one eyebrow raised the way mothers raise it when they're not about to let just anybody climb their stairs. But the man held the bags out like an offering at an altar. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough like gravel dragged under a boot. "Figured I owed you a thank you." Miss Lena let the door buzz once behind her. She nodded at the bags. "You the fellow who took my daughter's cash?" He chuckled low in his chest, like the sound of an engine turning over slow. "Yes, ma'am." "Didn't mean to," she insisted. Inside, Keisha pressed her cheek against the doorframe, peeking through the peephole. She watched as her mom softened, just a hair, enough to wave him up to the balcony. They sat side by side on the weathered bench Miss Lena's father once built with his own hands. The bags rested at their feet like quiet proof the world could still surprise you. Keisha lingered behind the door, listening, invisible, but soaking up every word like the sun through glass. He told them his name. Reaper. Just that. No last name, no title, no long list of sins and scars. Reaper, like the harvester, though he'd laid down more weapons than he cared to count. He said he'd once ridden with brothers who'd sworn nose and back alleys and roadside bars, men who stitched skulls and wings to their backs so the world would see them coming and step aside. West Coast chapters, rough ones, places Keisha only knew from TV where leather jackets spelled out warnings the way some folks wrote prayers. Miss Lena asked no questions about that life, just gave him the same look she gave Keisha when she scraped her knees. A look that asked, "Who hurt you and why did you let them?" Reaper didn't flinch under it. He told her about long roads and lost friends, about nights when he counted miles instead of blessings. And then he turned to Keisha. She came out slow, feet bare on the balcony tiles, that empty Gold's bottle dangling from her hand like a forgotten lantern. "You shouldn't have done that," he said to her, but there was no anger in it, just a softness rough men rarely show, giving away all you had. Keisha just shrugged, shoulders rising like they could carry more than any 10-year-old should. "It was just cash. I can get more." Reaper looked at Miss Lena, a silent question hanging between them, like he needed permission for something he hadn't yet found the courage to say. "I owe her," he finally said, voice steady as an idling motor. "And not just the gas. That bottle. That bottle reminded me there's still good I can pay back before my time's done." Miss Lena reached out, placed her calloused hand on Reaper's weathered wrist, not to forgive him for what he'd done before, but to mark that moment. This rough giant, this soft child, this balcony that had seen too much worry and not enough grace. He told Keisha to dream bigger, that doctors save lives, and maybe someday she'd patch up old men like him. Keisha just smiled, shy as a sunrise. "I just want to help people," she said. Mom says, "When you can help, you help. That's it." Reaper sat there a long time that afternoon, sipping iced tea that clinked with melting ice. He listened to Keisha chatter about school, about drawings she borrowed from the library 3 blocks away, about how someday she'd stand in a white coat and tell sick people they'd be okay. As the sun leaned low behind the crowded row of buildings, Reaper stood up and told her, "I owe you one, and I keep my debts close." Keisha looked at him, eyes wide but untroubled, and said it like it was nothing at all. It was just a few bucks. He left before the streetlights flickered on, drove that old SUV around the corner, and parked beneath a flickering street lamp where nobody would bother a man sitting alone. Inside the cab, the air thick with the ghost of gasoline and old leather, Reaper dug out his battered flip phone again. He scrolled past numbers he hadn't seen blink back at him since the days when payphones still stood on street corners, fingers trembling like the cold had seeped into his bones. He typed out a single message, a message no man wearing that patch would ever ignore. He hit send, shut his eyes, and waited for the rumble to come calling. Long after the streetlights flickered awake on Keisha's block, Reaper's message slipped through the dark like a spark looking for dry kindling. In the silence of that old SUV's cab, his thumb pressed send on a few simple words, a confession, and a promise wrapped up in a single line that would rattle iron fences clear across the country. "Could help me when no one would. She saved me from myself. I owe her my life." And like that, a ripple moved through phones propped on bar counters, sticky with spilled whiskey. It buzzed in truck stops where engines idled while men waited for dawn. It lit up screens inside dusty garages where old Harley frames hung from rusted chains and oil pooled beneath cracked concrete. It found the men who'd once ridden with Reaper through border towns and desert highways through nights so cold your breath turned to frost behind your face mask. Men who'd seen him swing fists when fists were all that kept the brotherhood breathing. Some hadn't spoken his name in years, not because they'd forgotten, but because the road has a way of swallowing certain stories whole. But when his words hit their phones, those stories rose up like old ghosts refusing to stay buried. In a dive bar just outside Tucson, a biker named Bolt read it aloud to 4 men, hunched over a table, littered with empty shot glasses and weathered playing cards. They listened in silence, nodding like priests hearing confession. Bolt told them about the summer Reaper hauled him out of a wreck when a bad run turned sideways. "He didn't have to," Bolt said, voice rough as the edge of a broken bottle. "Could have left me for the crows. But Reaper don't leave his own." In a cluttered garage outside Seattle, a gray-bearded man called Hammer slid his phone across the greasy workbench to a fresh prospect who was tightening the bolts on a battered chopper. "Read that," Hammer said. The kid read it once, twice, then asked who the kid was. Hammer just smiled through his cracked teeth. Doesn't matter who she is, she's family now. In a truck stop off I-5, a pair of brothers who'd once followed Reaper into a field to drag a brother's broken bike back onto the road stared at the blinking message on an ancient flip phone, same model Reaper still used. They ordered another round of burnt coffee, called up old contacts on burner numbers that still lived scribbled inside leather vests. And somewhere in every corner of every smoky bar and half-lit shop, they all remembered the same old oath. Spoken soft, never written. The only law some of them ever truly honored. One rider down, all riders rise. It didn't matter that Reaper hadn't ridden with them in years. Didn't matter that he'd traded open roads for the quiet weight of regret in an old Chevy. What mattered was that he'd called, and they answered in patches, stiff with years of sweat and road dust. They pulled out maps and scratched cities with marker lines. They called in favors from men who owed them more than apologies. They emptied toolboxes, packed saddlebags, filled gas cans till the nozzles clattered empty. In one bar, a man named Spike leaned against a scarred pool table and asked the question nobody needed to answer. So, we going to let this kid think she saved a ghost? And that's all there is to it? The room answered with the scrape of chairs, the clink of a beer bottle set down unfinished. Somebody muttered. She gave him $5. We'll give her an army. And so they agreed. Rough men and soft hearts, hidden under tattoos of skulls and iron wings. They'd show this kid what brotherhood looks like when it rides up your block and parks itself on your curb like a promise no debt collector can touch. Some packed extra blankets, some packed old toys their kids had long outgrown, some just packed themselves and the road dust that clung to their boots like proof they'd never really left the highway behind. When the last call was made, when the last map was folded into a pocket stitched to a cut that smelled of decades of wind and rain, the first engines turned over in the dead hush of 2 a.m., somewhere far from Keisha's cracked sidewalk and buzzing balcony light. Headlights flared awake in the dark. Carburetors coughed. Pipes rattled windows that hadn't known such thunder since the last storm season. One by one, steel horses roared into the night. A string of flickering tail lights stitched across sleeping highways, bound for the Edge apartment where a tired mother and a girl with an empty Goals bottle waited for a kindness they hadn't asked to be repaid. And in the hush between the engines and the dawn, a rumor moved like gospel through the chain link and neon that split America's back roads that somewhere out there, an African-American girl pressed a crumpled 5 into the palm of an old Hell's Angel. And in doing so, woke up an army of rough men who'd been waiting for one last chance to prove the world wrong about them. When dawn cracked its first pale lines through the blinds of Keisha's bedroom, the apartment felt different, like the walls themselves held their breath. Miss Lena was already awake, perched at the edge of her worn couch by the window. A faded throw clutched tight around her shoulders, as though fabric alone could quiet the rattle rising from the street. Keisha stirred at the low rumble, not the gentle hum of a delivery van or the pop and hiss of a city bus, but something deeper, layered, alive. It pulsed through the floorboards, vibrated in her ribs like a drumbeat she couldn't name. Her mom's voice drifted soft through the cracked door. "Baby, you might want to come see this." Keisha slipped out from under her thin sheet, her feet brushing the cold tile. She padded to the living room where the old blinds danced with the push of the draft. Miss Lena didn't say another word. She just nodded toward the window. Keisha pressed her small fingers to the glass, the cold seeping through her skin. Outside, where the cracked sidewalk met the gutter choked with last fall's trash. There was no street left to see, only chrome and leather, beards and patches, heavy boots planted in dirt lots and leaning on battered railings. Rows upon rows of motorcycles, engines coughing to silence as men swung thick legs over iron saddles one after another until the block looked less like a neighborhood and more like the parking lot of some half-remembered outlaw rally. They didn't shout. They didn't blast radios or pop wheelies like the boys she sometimes saw tearing through the back alleys. They just stood, a silent sea of worn denim, black leather cracked by years on open highways, tattooed knuckles shoved deep in pockets against the morning chill. Some smoked cheap cigarettes, the ember tips flaring like fireflies trapped in beards. Some nodded to each other without words, eyes fixed on the small balcony where Miss Lina and her daughter peered through faded blinds. Word slipped quick through the street like oil on rain. Neighbors cracked doors, peeked from behind parted curtains. Old Mrs. Jenkins from next door shuffled out in house slippers, mouth hanging open like she'd stumbled into a scene from a story too wild for her quiet years. A mother down the block tugged her child back inside by the collar when he stepped too close to the curb. And somewhere just out of sight, a black and white patrol car rolled slow along the gutter, tires crunching the broken asphalt. The officer behind the wheel, young, nervous, knuckles white on the steering wheel, rolled down his window just enough to catch the whisper of engines cooling down. His radio crackled, but he didn't say much. What could he say? 1,000 men in cuts and patches. No academy class prepared him to read. Inside the apartment, Keisha turned wide eyes up at Miss Lina. The woman's hand rested heavy on her shoulder, not to steady Keisha, but to steady herself. Then came the knock, soft for knuckles like reapers, but heavy enough to break the silence of the old door that buzzed on its tired hinge. Miss Lina flinched. Keisha didn't move. She held her breath as Reaper's shadow settled against the frosted glass. He didn't pound, didn't shout. Just waited, hat in one hand, shoulders squared like he knew what kind of storm he'd called down on their balcony. When the door swung open, Reaper dipped his head. He looked older in the thin morning light, leather jacket zipped tight, hair pulled back, eyes ringed with sleepless hours and the miles that had crawled under his skin. "Miss Lina," he said, voice graveled but warm, like an old motor that still turned over when you needed it most. "Don't be afraid. They're not here to cause trouble." Miss Lina's mouth twitched at the corner. Not quite a smile, not quite forgiveness. "Then what in God's name are they here for, Reaper?" He turned to Keisha. Then Keisha, whose Goals bottle sat empty by her bedside while the street outside overflowed with iron and thunder. "They're here for her," he said, "to pay back what can't rightly be paid." Keisha blinked up at him, a question forming on her tongue, but never making it past her lips. She didn't understand how a handful of bills could ripple so wide, didn't see the way her small mercy cracked open a man's rusted heart and called forth a brotherhood that hadn't gathered like this in years. Behind Reaper, the rumble settled to the quiet purr of idling engines. Boots scraped gravel. A few riders pulled off their gloves, passing something between calloused palms. Small things, folded papers, envelopes, an old keychain, a tarnished medallion that meant nothing to the world but everything to the man who carried it. And then from the middle of that leather and steel tide, one biker stepped forward. His beard caught the wind like a tangle of old stories. Patches stitched onto his vest so thick they looked like armor. He pulled from his back pocket a single piece of paper. Edges oil-smudged, corners soft from too many times being folded and unfolded under gas station lights. He held it out to Reaper, who glanced at it only long enough to nod once, sharp and certain. He turned back to Miss Lina and Keisha and laid the paper gentle in Miss Lina's calloused hands. "This here," Reaper said, voice low, but carrying like the last promise of an old oath is the plan. It's time you knew what this family really means. Miss Lena's fingers trembled around the note. Keisha leaned closer, breath caught in her chest like a held prayer. Outside, the 1,000 bikes stood patient, engines cooling, hearts warming, waiting for the signal that what they'd come for would not be turned away. By the time the sun finished rising over Keisha's block, the air smelled not of fear, but of something older and sweeter. The scent of warm engines cooling beside charcoal fires, of leather that carried stories in every crease, of laughter cracking open in places where only silence used to live. It started small. One biker, broad-shouldered, silver chain around his neck that looked older than Keisha's mother had been, stepped forward, boots scuffing the dusty path up to the balcony. He didn't say much, just dug into his pocket, pulled out a battered envelope sealed with a scrap of duct tape. He held it out to Keisha with both hands like an offering too holy for words. Keisha looked at her mom. Miss Lena's eyes said, "Take it, baby." So she did. Tiny fingers closing around something that felt heavier than its weight. The biker nodded once as if to say, "You earned this," and stepped aside. Another came forward, shorter, round belly pressing against the snaps of his vest, tattoos crawling down his arms like winding rivers. He didn't have an envelope. He pressed a small drawstring pouch into her palm instead. It clinked when she tilted it, a mess of old rings and a locket on a tarnished chain. "Belonged to my mama," he rasped out, voice catching like gravel in his throat. "She'd want you to have it for luck." And so they came. And not all at once, but in a slow, steady line that curled around the balcony, down the broken steps, across the patch of concrete where weeds clawed through old cracks. Some brought folded bills tucked into spare gas station envelopes. Some slipped gift cards into her hands with awkward smiles. One man, face hidden behind mirrored shades, pressed an old coin into her palm. A silver dollar worn smooth by years of fingers flipping it for luck. "Kept me alive more than once," he said. "Reckon it'll do the same for you." Keisha didn't know what to say. She just nodded each time. A soft thank you whispered like a prayer that fluttered out into the hush between engines. And in that hush, the bikers spoke, some with words, some with only eyes that held old truths. They told her pieces of themselves they'd never written down. Nights spent cold under overpasses, fights that left scars hidden under sleeves, families that turned them out, and roads that took them in. One rough voice cracked as he said, "I was 13 when Reaper found me behind a diner half frozen, taught me to ride, taught me to stand up straight when the world wanted me bent. You did that for him, kid. You gave him back that feeling." Another muttered, "We're all just lost sometimes. Takes one good soul to remind you the road still leads home." Through it all, Reaper stood just off to the side, arms crossed over his chest, to soften the corners. When the last envelope was passed, when the last rough hand squeezed Keisha's tiny shoulder, he stepped up. No envelope for him, just a thick paper packet he pressed straight into Miss Lena's hands. "Count it when you're ready," he told her. "Pay off what's owed. Put what's left toward her schooling. She's got goals. Let's keep 'em bigger than a water bottle." Miss Lena held it tight to her chest, paper crinkling under the weight of debts lifted. Her eyes glistened, but her voice stayed firm. The way mothers hold steady when the world tries to crumble under them. "You didn't have to," she told Reaper. He only shook his head. "I did. She did for me. Now we do for her." And as if some unspoken signal drifted on the breeze, the hush broke open. Engines growled. Laughter rolled down the block like warm thunder, and hands reached for coolers stashed in saddlebags. Somebody dragged out a rusted barbecue pit, balanced it on bricks. Another pulled a pack of hot dogs from a saddlebag stuffed between tools and a spare chain. One biker with a voice like a church bell called out for a wrench. And in minutes, nails rang into old railings that had sagged so long, Miss Lena had stopped believing they could stand straight again. Neighbors gathered in doorways, confusion melting to curiosity. A little boy from 2 buildings over crept onto the lot. Wide-eyed at the shining chrome and deep rumble of bikes parked bumper to bumper, a biker with arms like tree trunks lifted him onto his seat. Let him twist the throttle just once. The roar jolted through the boys' laughter like fireworks on the 4th of July. Grills hissed with dripping fat and hot coals. The broken balcony steps were mended by men who once swung wrenches on choppers under moonlight, but now swung hammers like they'd been born carpenters. Someone painted over the peeling doorframe, bright white covering years of weathered neglect. Miss Lena tried to protest. "You don't have to do all this." But Reaper only shook his head again. "We protect what protects us, simple as that." And so the block party bloomed, a gathering loud enough to echo through the neighborhood's long-forgotten corners. For once, Keisha's Edge apartment didn't feel like the tired end of a tired street. It felt like the center of something bigger, a promise stitched from engine oil and leather, from rough hands building where once they broke. But not every window that cracked open held a smile. Not every neighbor's whisper carried warmth. Some eyes narrowed at the patches, the boots, the roar that shook old railings awake, and somewhere behind the drawn blinds of a tidy unit across the street. A voice dialed 3 numbers into his cell phone, a voice that couldn't quite believe that rough men could mean anything good. And while Keisha laughed for the first time that month, laughter caught in the smoke of grilling meat and the chime of old coins dropped into a fresh bottle. A question curled through the block like a cold draft under a locked door. What happens when the world outside decides kindness looks too rough to trust? As the day stretched on, what started as a hush of engines and quiet men spread past Keisha's block. Word slipped under doors and over fences that 1,000 rough men had parked their iron horses beside a poor girl's balcony. That the same hands that once swung chains in roadside bars were now patching railings and flipping burgers for kids too shy to ask for seconds. But kindness, real unpolished kindness, rattles the walls of folks who've only known roughness to come with strings attached. So while laughter rose above the cracked sidewalks, so did unease. It started with sideways glances from tidy lots. Lawnmowers paused mid-row. Hedge clippers froze amid snip. Whispers crawled down phone lines and across backyards. Who are they? What do they want? The sight of so much leather and ink and oil smeared into patched vests did not rest easy on a town that kept its fear tidy and its trust guarded behind neat fences. Before long, squad cars rolled through in slow loops, tires crunching gravel, lights off, but presence loud. They didn't blast sirens, didn't bark orders. They just watched 2 uniformed men in each cruiser, eyes hidden behind mirrored shades that reflected back rows of bikes in the glint of silver crosses stitched into sun-bleached cuts. Then came the news vans. Antennas scraped the low branches of street trees. Local station logos splashed on the side doors like flags at half-mast. Outspilled reporters with notepads flapping. Cameramen lugging tripods across Miss Lena's patch of struggling concrete. Microphones buzzed under the hum of a community gathering that looked nothing like the small-town events they were used to covering. Somewhere behind a tangle of camera cables, a woman with too much blush on her cheeks and a tight smile leaned toward her cameraman. "You get the girl's name yet? Get her on tape. She's the hook." They called Keisha forward at first with polite hands waving her over, then with mics thrust toward her like small silver weapons. She hesitated, clutching the hem of her faded t-shirt, eyes flitting from Reaper to her mom and back again. The biker stood watchful behind her, arms crossed, boots planted, not menacing, not growling, just there. A wall of rough mercy wearing old road miles like medals. The camera's red light blinked awake. The reporter bent low, voice syrupy sweet. "Honey, tell us why they're here. Aren't you scared?" Keisha's small shoulders tensed. She glanced at Reaper, who gave her nothing but a nod. That slow, steady nod that told her she was braver than any of them had ever been. She cleared her throat, voice trembling at first, soft as the hush that hangs over old churches before the hymn begins. "They're not here to scare us," she said. So quiet. The cameraman leaned in closer. "They're family now. That's all." The reporter opened her mouth for another question. Something slick, something that would spin the headline back to fear and roughness. But Reaper stepped up beside Keisha, broad shoulders blocking out the lens for a heartbeat. His shadow fell over the microphone like a closing door. He looked dead into the camera, not blinking, not shifting, just speaking like a man who'd once made his name in dark bars and cold parking lots, and now stood on a balcony painted fresh by his brother's hands. "This kid," he said, voice thick like tar, but steady as an open road, gave more than any of us ever did. She gave without asking. "We're just paying it forward, the only way we know how. Folks scared of that ought to ask themselves why they'd fear a good thing just because it looks different than they're used to." Somewhere behind the camera's glare, the murmurs stilled for a breath. Miss Lena squeezed Keisha's hand so tight her tiny knuckles shone white. The bikers shifted their boots on gravel, a quiet reminder that brotherhood doesn't flinch when the world points bright lights and questions that drip with suspicion. And yet, suspicion always finds a way in. At the edge of the lot, the rumble of fresh squad cars grew louder. One door opened with a squeal that drew eyes away from the barbecue pits and patched cuts. An officer, tall, fresh-faced, the shine of academy nerves still clinging to his collar, stepped out. He scanned the lot, the news vans, the patched vests that lined the street like an iron fence. His gaze settled on Reaper, the man who looked like trouble but spoke like kin. Boots crunching over the concrete. The officer came close enough to catch the smoke drifting from the grill. He cleared his throat, voice carrying just enough authority to hush the laughter for a heartbeat. "Sir," he said to Reaper, carefully polite but steady. "Going to have to ask you to wrap this up. Neighbors are complaining. Too much noise, too much worry." Reaper didn't move at first. He looked past the officer's shoulder, at Keisha, at Miss Lena's balcony, fixed fresh at the bikes lined up like sentinels refusing to move. He exhaled long and slow like a man trying to measure just how much road he could stretch before the law called it done. And in that tight, watchful silence, the promise of thunder held its breath, waiting to see if kindness could stand its ground when the world knocked at the gate. By late afternoon, the street felt softer somehow. Not quieter, not empty, but changed in a way the wind can't quite explain when it drifts through tired buildings. The grills hissed down to embers. The last burger flipped onto a paper plate for a barefoot boy who swore he'd never wash the grease from his chin. The bikers, one by one, checked their straps, kicked at their tires, tugged at leather sleeves stiff with the weight of a past that never quite lets go. Boots scuffed the curb where only hours ago they'd stood like an army with nothing but kindness for ammunition. They didn't say long goodbyes. Men like this never did. Instead, they lingered in small knots, heads bent low over Keisha's tiny shoulders, their voices rough but gentle as they pressed small gifts into her small hands. One man, road name stitched in red as Bolt peeled a patch from his vest, thread dangling like loose promise. He bent low, pinned it to Keisha's sleeve himself. "Means you're family now," he muttered, voice thick with miles. "Means you ride with us even when you're standing still." Another passed her a chain, a tiny silver cross swinging from it, dulled by sweat and rain, but brighter in the lines of Keisha's palm than any polished jewel. "Kept me safe through 3 states and 2 bad nights," he rasped. "Figured it ought to keep you safe, too." Some handed her coins. "Old biker superstition. You never run out of road money if you keep a coin from a brother." A few slipped stickers, pins, hand-carved trinkets made in prison workshops or behind gas stations on long nights where time had nowhere else to go. Miss Lena stood at the top of the steps, arms folded tight across her chest to keep the wind from knowing how much her bones trembled at the goodbye. Reaper climbed those steps last. The old man's boots thudded on the fresh painted boards like punctuation marks on a letter never finished. He didn't speak first, just opened his arms wide enough for Miss Lena to see the boy he used to be, hidden beneath leather and road dust, and the hush of things he'd never say out loud. She let him fold her in old woman and older man, holding tight like something fragile had passed between them, and neither was willing to drop it. "If anyone ever messes with her," Reaper murmured, voice so low it curled into her ear like a secret vow. "They mess with us." Miss Lena pulled back enough to see his eyes, softer now, tired but burning with a promise no badge or uniform could ever stamp out. She nodded once, a quiet amen caught in the crease of her smile. Keisha stood a few feet back, the tokens of 1,000 roads cupped to her chest. She watched as Reaper swung a leg over his waiting bike, heavy boots thunking the pavement that just yesterday felt like the end of the world, and today felt like the start of something her bottle could never quite hold. Engines fired awake, one by one, a soft rumble that rolled under doorsteps and bounced off brick walls like an old song half remembered. The convoy didn't peel out or roar reckless. They drifted off slow, handlebars steady, patches catching the wind like flags from an army that left no battle behind. Only rebuilt balconies and railings hammered straight. Keisha's eyes followed them till the last chrome glint blinked out behind the stop sign at the far end of the block. She didn't wave. She didn't need to. Some goodbyes don't ask for hands raised high. Some stay stitched under your skin, humming soft as a motor idling under your ribs. By the time the street fell silent, neighbors peeked out again, curiosity replacing the tight twist of fear. Some kids tiptoed onto Keisha's lot, brushing fingers over the bike tire marks like they were relics from a dream too bright to last. Keisha turned back to the balcony, Miss Lena's hand warm on the small of her back, guiding her inside. They stepped through a doorway, newly painted, hinges no longer squeaking like a bad memory. The living room smelled of grilled meat and fresh sweat and something older. The scent of strangers turned kin. It wasn't until Keisha went in her bedroom, coins and patches still clutched to her chest, that she found it tucked quiet under her pillow, like a bedtime promise nobody had to say out loud. A single folded note, grease-smudged at the corner, where a thumb held it too long. Her name scratched across the front in Reaper's rough scroll. She held it there for a moment, listening to the echo of distant engines curling down roads she'd never see, roads that now somehow always circle back to her. She slipped her finger under the fold, breath held in the hush that follows thunder. The paper was soft at the edges, not from age, but from the way Reaper's fingers must have traced it before tucking it under the pillow where Keisha would find it. She unfolded it slow, careful as if the words might slip free and drift out the window if she hurried. Inside, only a handful of lines scratched out in a hand used to gripping handlebars tighter than pens. "Keep helping people. Someday you'll wear your own patch. Reaper. Simple as that. A promise tucked inside a whisper of ink. That kindness rides longer than any road. That mercy sticks to a soul like engine oil under fingernails. Keisha held it there on her bed, fingers brushing each letter like she could hear Reaper's growl of a voice reading it aloud. Each word heavier than any $5 bill she'd ever pressed into a stranger's palm. Time rolled on like it always does. The railing stayed mended. The balcony stayed bright under fresh coats of paint the neighbors now offered to touch up each spring. Miss Lena's laugh came easier when she sat on that balcony bench, hips creaking less than the old hinges ever did. Keisha took that hush of thunder and turned it outward. Some of the money stayed sealed for the future. School, textbooks, maybe a uniform with her name stitched at the pocket. But the rest, she poured it right back into the cracks that birthed her. A pantry grew under the old awning, shelves stacked with cans, boxes, bread rolls bagged fresh by hands that remembered what an empty belly feels like. Kids from 3 blocks over lined up shy at first, then braver, laughing when Keisha cracked open the door to that pantry like a promise. No questions asked, no forms signed, just a bag in a hand, and a word of hope slipped in like loose change. Sometimes at dusk, when the street dipped quiet and the last neighbor locked the gate, the hush would break just enough to catch her ear. The distant roll of a single engine weaving through the side streets, never stopping long enough to gather dust. Reaper never knocked, never lingered more than a heartbeat. A lone figure under a helmet, chrome flickering like an old ghost in the orange spill of the streetlights. A reminder stitched in engine noise and the slow fade of tail lights that some debts pay themselves forward forever. Inside her room, taped to the mirror above her bed, Reaper's note stayed right where she could see it every dawn. A road map written in 10 rough words. A reminder that even a bottle labeled goals can build something bigger than itself. So the block never forgot. How one small 5 cracked open an army's heart. How a girl with dirt under her nails and hope in her palms turned a Hungry Edge apartment into a warm beacon on cold nights. One small 5, one act of kindness, and 1,000 roaring reminders that even the roughest souls remember who showed them grace. This story may be done, but yours isn't. Subscribe. Share it with someone who needs reminding that small acts can echo far. Thanks for watching.